And that someone is God, who spoke through his Son, who spoke through an angel, giving it to John. So let's understand the importance of these messages. These were messages from Jesus Christ to his chosen saints. Where are we today? That's the essential question. That's where I want to go with this. Where are we today? Well, there's a message for today. In fact, there has been a message to God's church throughout history. Jesus Christ speaks to his own, and he tells them things they need to know about themselves and what they need to do. Today's subject is not one that's talked about as much as it used to be. Our former association had a heavy interest in their own identification, and there was a particular focus on the Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea messages in the second and third chapters of the book of Revelation, one of which was just read in the introduction. There are people who kind of draw back from what used to be taught about that. And I can partly understand why, because perhaps there was a little more manipulation of the idea, and maybe it was taken to a degree that was perhaps a little beyond what it should have been. But there's people who reject the idea of these 7 messages being church eras. And they do so largely because of their reaction to the emphasis that was put on it in the past. What a lot of people don't realize, and I don't know how many here can say the same thing, but the idea of church eras is not unique to the WCG. Now, that's where a lot of people heard it first, and the only place they heard it first. But there's other denominations who understand the same thing. For example, the Baptists do. The evangelical fundamentalists understand it. And the Adventists. I can show you articles that have been written by these various organizations that talk about those 7 messages and their prophetic application. Now, they're kind of unique in a way because they're not just prophetic. We understand them to be contemporary. There were these 7 actual congregations, and they had the characteristics that are described. There is also the universality of the application, where any person or any congregation in any time frame can exhibit those same characteristics that are described. And it's up to the people to recognize themselves in what it says. But then, of course, there's the prophetic application, and this idea of church eras is derived from the point of view that it describes the 7 characteristics of the churches throughout history. And that's very logical when you look at it, because the early church was different from the churches that existed a little subsequent to them. There are scholars who have gone through history and identified these particular groups. Ephesus church in Revelation 2 was predominant from about 30 AD through 135, so about 100 years. The Smyrna church, from about that point in time till the middle 400s. a period of about 300 years. Pergamos is identified as being from about 450 to 1050, a period of 600 years. These people, these worshipers, exhibited the same characteristic through many generations, according to the Thyatira was predominant from about 1050 to 1600 AD, a period of 550 years. And it became the Waldensians after about 1173. But the point is, the church throughout history has changed in its characteristics from various factors. Now, our organization focused on the final three: Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. And we tended to identify with Philadelphia for various reasons. The Philadelphia congregation has no negative assessment given of it. It's very highly praised. And it has things about it that sounded awfully much like our situation. Now let's look at that. I think it's interesting. It's in Revelation chapter 3. Begins in verse 7, where it says, "And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, These things says he that is holy, he that is true, he that has the key of David, he that opens and no man shuts, and shuts and no man opens. I know your works. Behold, I have set before you an open door, and no man can shut it. For you have a little strength, and has kept my word, and has not denied my name. Behold, I will make them of the synagogue of Satan, which say they are Jews and are not, but do lie. Behold, I will make them to come and to worship before your feet, and to know that I have loved you, because you have kept the word of my patience. I also will keep you from the hour of temptation, which shall come upon the world to try them that dwell upon the earth. Behold, I come quickly. Hold that fast which thou hast, that no man take thy crown." Him that overcometh will I make a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go no more out. And I will write upon him the name of my God, and the name of the city of my God, which is New Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God, and I will write upon him my new name. He that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says unto the churches. Now, this was not a message from John. It was not a message from John at all. The book of Revelation begins by saying the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave to him to show unto his servants things which must shortly come to pass. And he sent and signified it by an angel unto his servant John. But the point is, this message is not written by John. John didn't know these people. He was in exile on an island in the Mediterranean. He didn't know them personally, but someone knew their spiritual characteristics. And that someone is God, who spoke through his Son, who spoke through an angel, giving it to John. So let's understand the importance of these messages. Now, I said other denominations understand this idea of church eras. It's not unique to us. I remember as a kid in the Baptist church hearing all about church eras. They had their own succession of organizations that they identified with, but they were at least smart enough to know that not to include one particular major Christian organization in their church history. They differed from us in the succession that we posed, but they had pretty much the idea. Wikipedia says of this idea, some historicists typically interpret the seven churches as representing seven different periods in the history of the Western Church, from the time of Paul until the return of Jesus Christ. The Schofield Bible has this: these messages by their very terms go beyond the local assemblies mentioned. He is of the opinion that the letters have a prophetic purpose, disclosing the seven phases of the spiritual history of the church. There are other writers, such as Clarence Larkin, Henry Halley, you're familiar with the Halley's Bible Handbook, Merrill Unger, Bible Dictionary, and others, have also posited the view that the seven churches preview the history of the global church. And notice what they don't call it. Thank you. They don't call it the universal church. They recognize something as well. But we have solid evidence that the era's understanding was known from the time of the Middle Ages. This is not something new. This is a symbol of what we know as the Waldensians. And as I showed you earlier, they were recognized as the Thyatiran era by some. But it's very interesting what they chose as their organizational logo. And there's many versions of this. But this would be from back around the 1100s. They recognized themselves as the fourth star. Their flame points to the fourth star. And their logo in Latin says, light illuminates the darkness. They understood who they were. And this is an indication that the idea of church eras has been known for at least 800 years. So it's not a new thing, and it was not unique to our organization, but people have understood the prophetic sense and the succession that we see in the New Testament. These were messages from Jesus Christ to his chosen saints. Now, this image also shows something else that they recognized, and Dr. Hay brought this out in a message many, many years ago, that the seven churches stand upon their own candlestick. They're not branches of a menorah, as you would see perhaps in Jewish organizations. These have their own candlestick. And God says in some places that he will take their candlestick away if they're not faithful to their calling. So it can happen. It isn't a matter of breaking off one branch. It's a matter of taking that whole candlestick away, and it's being succeeded by another. So these are things we need to understand. But I want to bring this up to date. And by doing so, I think we need to sidestep the distractions of the old view of what these represented. It's understandable that we would identify with Philadelphia, but I wonder if that's totally appropriate. Because there are many characteristics in the Philadelphians that we had a problem with, let's be honest. We might still, in our various organizations that claim to carry the mantle. I'm not so sure, but we'd have to assess that ourselves, individually and collectively. But the prophetic application is, as hopefully has been illustrated to this point, is eras, not organizations. Eras, not churches. An era is a span of time. And any number of people, any number of congregations, any number of ministries can fall within those eras. They outlast any living individual. So keep in mind, we're talking eras. And those eras exhibit a characteristic that is found among the people in those eras. Now, what about our era today? What are we like? Are we like the people 200 years ago? Are we like the people 1,000 years ago? If you were to compare them with us, I think you'd find we're different. We live in the modern age. We exhibit modern attitudes. We are like we are. They're not like us. We're not like them. There is a progression in the spiritual development of God's church. And I think that's what Jesus Christ has laid out for us, to understand that we're not all the same. Okay? There are differences. There are things that need correction, and there are things that are commendable. I had another thought here, if I can call it back up. The first century church, as an era, involved many different ministries. There were different apostles who went to different areas, who taught their own way, but commonly the same as far as doctrinal matters are concerned. They didn't differ one another. They were just different personalities. And likely as a result, their personalities were reflected in their congregations. That's to be understood. But there's a general characteristic that Jesus Christ is bringing out. Now, something else to notice, that the messages you see in Revelation 2 and 3 were not to the ministry. Did you ever notice that? They were not to the ministry. They were to the people. These characteristics were exhibited by the people. God is correcting the people. He is overreaching the ministry to get to the people. Did we ever pay attention to that? Now, there's some unique characteristics, and I've reflected some of those in the candles up above us here. That the first three, Ephesus, Smyrna, and Pergamos, are very likely extinct. I don't think there's any remnant of those anymore. However, the next three, in each of those next three, he says to them, hold fast till I come. Which suggests to me perhaps there's a remnant of each of these that are going to still be in existence right up till the time of the second coming. Now, there's another curiosity that you'll find as you read these, and that is the reversal. There's an important reversal. The first three messages talk about, let me find it here. I'm going to go to, just for an example, let's go to chapter 2, in verse 7, Revelation 2:7. He that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says unto the churches. And then he says, to him that overcometh will I this and that. He that has an ear and he that overcomes. Okay, that's the pattern in the first three. In the second three, he flips that around. He talks about him that overcomes, and then he goes on to say, he that has ears to hear, let him hear. So there's another distinction between the first three and the last three. Just a little point of interest to show. Why that is, I can't tell you exactly, but it's just something to notice, that there is a distinction between one group of messages and another group of messages. But this too, that approach also illustrates the individuality of the candlesticks. They're not connected where one arm supports the other. These are separate and distinct churches. And if you look back in the history of the Church of God, you'll find that one didn't necessarily grow out of the other. Another thing too important, God calls someone who he is going to use to raise up a new congregation when the old one became passé. That's another thing that we can discern from these messages. Churches 4, 5, and 6 are told to hold fast. Now, he doesn't say that to Laodicea, but it's the second group of 3. They're told to hold fast till he comes. The scene in the 7th in Laodicea is very different from the others. A totally different characteristic. Laodicea has always been somewhat of an enigma. I can remember as a preteen in the early and mid-50s being alleged that the church then was Laodicean. I can partly believe it. Laodicean means what? Well, Albert read that message. People who were lukewarm, so lukewarm that they turned God's stomach. He says, I'm going to spew you out. And the Old English choice of words and the translators kind of missed the point. It isn't just a matter of spitting. It's a matter of, you look at the original word, it's more like vomiting, okay? He was so turned off with the characteristics of the Laodicean people that it made him barf, okay? Imagine that. God can puke. Can happen. But what does that say? Where are we today? That's the essential question. That's where I want to go with this. Where are we today? Are we in the Church of God lukewarm? Would you say we're on fire? Some people, I suppose, are. But are we? Or are we sort of laid back, lackadaisical, ho-hum, not upset about anything, not motivated about anything? All kinds of crazy stuff can happen all around us, and we just ho-hum along. Should we? Now, it's not just this church. It's not just God's ecclesia that are this way. The churches of this world are just the same. Society is just the same. We live in an age where it's normal to be non-polarized. And I'm not talking politically necessarily. I'm just saying we don't get motivated by much of anything anymore. That is a condition of our generation. And Jesus Christ had the foresight to see how it was going to play out in the end. And certainly has. Now, our former association assigned the Laodicean era to a very brief span of time. And when we think about it, it just didn't work, it didn't play out. They were playing games with organizations, and it really wasn't an organizational issue. It was more the fact of the general characteristic of the people of the time. That's where Laodiceanism factors into this. Thing is, what should we do about it? What should we do? It was thought that at one point in time, we would all grab our suitcases and jump on a plane and fly over to the Middle East to be protected for 3.5 years of final training. That's how this thing developed out. That's where the thinking took us. Now stop and think today. Who would you trust to ring that bell and say, hey, time to go, folks? Who would you trust? Think about it. Think of the leaders of our various organizations. Which one are you going to rely on to drop everything, abandon everything you got, and head for the Middle East? A place where Jesus says, when you see this, get out of there. Why would we be, going in? Just something to think about. Of course, we didn't expect that the so-called end of the work, as some claimed it was, would be 40 years. It's been that already. Wait a minute. But who would we trust to go to a place, and in this age with all the health issues going on, how would we even get a visa? Would we crash a country without getting a visa? I mean, it's done all the time here, but I mean, only one way. It doesn't work the other way. Let me tell you, folks. Is it practical? Is our previous understanding practical? I don't think so. We need to face the reality of our time based on what we see all around us, and hopefully based on what we see in ourselves. Are we lackadaisical to a degree that it's a fault? This is the question for the time. We know what he says about the Laodicean people. In whatever time frame they lived, we certainly see that today in society, in religianity, and as a general picture, and unfortunately, in ourselves. And that's what we need to be concerned about. That's what we need to address ourselves to by way of self-examination. Are we doing all that we ought to be doing? And how important is it? Well, it's certainly important. Let's think about our time right now. The message to Laodicea was that they thought they were rich and fat and have need of nothing. What does that tell us? Because we're heading into a period of time right now where the world economies are in serious trouble. It's not just here. I mean, we're in trouble. But so is China, so is Europe. Argentina, a number of countries are facing serious economic collapse. We're not hearing much about it, but we are. When the world economy implodes, how does that affect the picture of what we suspect is going to be happening? If we've got health issues that are made into enormously important situations, where people can't even leave their town, let alone migrate to the Middle East, how does that factor in? We have to understand these messages in a correct application to the reality of our time right now. Lukewarmness is a disease that feeds on itself. And it can cause the person to not see. He makes emphasis of eye salve. Interesting, because that town was a manufacturing center for eye salve. If you read the history of these actual towns, whoever wrote this message knew what was going on in those towns. He described their geography in some cases. He described their industry in some cases. Not just their attitudes or not just their spiritual conditions. Whoever wrote these messages, and we know who it was, knew them personally and geographically, which speaks to the validity of what we're reading. The message alludes to a general prosperity in that span of time. People who think they need nothing. Is that anything like today? Do we live in a prosperous world? Now let's understand from Revelation 13:17, we can see that the beast power is going to be controlling all economies. It's not going to be possible to engage in commerce without the approval of that system. Okay? Think about the application of that to our reality. The beast power, towards the end, the last 3.5, 4 years, is going to be in control of, is going to be in possession of the Middle East, particularly Jerusalem. He's going to set up his world headquarters in Jerusalem. Is that a place where you would want to flee at the time? Think about that. For that matter, would it be a place where Jesus Christ would descend with his saints while that condition was still there? Tells us something. Before he and his saints descend to the Mount of Olives, that situation has to be corrected. The occupation of the beast power of Jerusalem and its environment is going to have to be resolved. It's not a good place to take your new bride. Okay? Now we're going to be talking about that at the feast very specifically. I've got a new booklet. If I gave anyone the old booklet, I'd like it back. I've got new ones with a whole new chapter in it. But some interesting stuff. It's interesting how the bride of Christ, the marriage of the Lamb, is going to factor into the overall sequence of events. But that's for another day. But the thing is, our commission, our message, what Jesus Christ is saying to us now, is that we need to be more zealous. We need to be more motivated. We need to be aware. There's that verse that says in 2 Timothy 2:15, study to show yourself approved unto God, a workman that needs not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. Nice words, phrased beautifully. But have we thought about that? We need to be approved unto God. And the way we do that is to study, which implies doing some degree of research, some degree of analysis, right? And to determine what is true and what isn't, and to draw a conclusion that becomes the foundation of our belief system and our character. There's a lot in that one little verse. Study to show yourself approved unto God. Now, that's suggesting that some aren't going to be approved. Now, that's not talking about the world and the general population. I came across something that I think is sobering, and it's something that we perhaps need to keep in mind always. We've been called, We've been given a measure of God's Spirit. We have understanding that is not just intellectually based. There's more to it when God's Spirit's involved. But in Matthew 8:12, there's this interesting statement where he says, "But the children of the kingdom shall be cast out into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Now we can read over that and sort of conclude that, well, this is talking about the world. No. It's talking about the children of the kingdom. Okay? Now does that reflect back on the approved unto God situation? There are people who, at some point in their lives, are destined for the kingdom, but they're going to be selected out, set aside, cast out into outer darkness. And it says there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now that's an interesting expression, weeping and gnashing of teeth. And I only realized this morning that that expression is used, not applied to the general public. That term is used largely, if not exclusively, in application to the people who have been called of God, who are at some point in time destined for the kingdom. Luke 13:28. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth when you shall see Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all the prophets in the kingdom of God, and you yourselves thrust out. Is that a reflection on the Laodicean condition? Now, the world at large is not going to know who Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the prophets are. It means nothing to them. This is people familiar with God's way of life. These are people who otherwise would have been included in the kingdom, but for some reason, they're thrust out. And the weeping and gnashing of teeth thing is an expression of their frustration for realizing that they blew it. That's why you get that reaction. You don't get that reaction from some bum on the street who's never gave a hoot about anything religious. Okay? No, that reaction comes from people who realized that they blew their opportunity. Matthew 25:30, another place. It says, "And cast you the unprofitable servant into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Same thing. The unprofitable servant. This isn't someone who's not a servant. Okay, it's someone who is a servant, who just doesn't never produce anything of any value to God. Okay? Do you see how this is applying to God's people, not the world at large? I think the Apostle Paul recognized what I'm talking about. If you go to 1 Corinthians 9:27, I think he realized that even he, with all of his accomplishments, with all that God could use him for, he himself recognized the danger. He says, "But I keep under my body and bring it unto subjection, lest that by any means, when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway." Can you imagine the Apostle Paul thinking that of himself? That he could be a potential castaway? If he let himself go? If he got soft? If he became lackadaisical, Can you imagine that? He thought so. Do we? Here's the thing. We need to be attentive to our condition. We need to fire up what zeal we can. We need to tap into God's Spirit more than ever, especially as these days close in around us. We're heading into some rough times. I'm sure we don't understand or can't even comprehend the dimensions of what's coming. The world before Christ returns is going to be one magnificent, one enormous disaster field. Are we on the fringe? Or are we in the middle of it? Hard to say. Some will be, I'm sure. But here's the thing. However you want to consider the church era's idea, however you want to consider it, immaterial. What's important is don't exhibit the characteristics of the Laodicean. It's not okay. It's not a good idea. Being laid back, being soft, being unmotivated when there's something important out there. Okay? No. He that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches.
You have received this information based upon the Word of God. Every additional topic concerning the truth, which originates in Scripture, builds understanding leading to salvation. We hope you will personally review the Scriptures cited in this presentation. God will teach you if you ask Him. Until next time, good day.